Members of Chancellery, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. Global food security is one of the urgent issues of our time, with 1 billion people of the world's 6.8 unable to meet their dietary needs. It's a real issue. They're malnourished and many of them, of course, are starving. And we know that there's going to be an additional 3 billion mouths to feed by 2050. Food output, it's been predicted, will need to almost double from what it is today to 2050 if we're going to feed these people. How can we do that? How can this be achieved? How can we end up with a food-secure future into the middle of this century? Because we already understand the constraints, and they're a little bit daunting. There's very little additional arable land available to bring into production globally. Productivity rates have tapered off and have plateaued, and that's not so good for trying to produce more food on the land we have. Water availability, many of you will know, is a real issue, and people are going to face severe water scarcity, even just for drinking water. There'll be billions of people facing that. And climate change, if we don't keep it to the 2 degrees, and even if we do, there's problems, but climate change will potentially lead to a great many places like Bangladesh, China, India and Indonesia, those fertile deltas actually going underwater, creating climate change refugees. People have suggested up to 200 million. Where do those people go and what do they eat? There's some of the questions. The other thing that's happening today, and I'm sure will come up in this forum, is the move towards the production of biofuels. One of the things about biofuels is that it does seem like a very good way to drive our cars. It's a much more carbon-friendly way, but while we're taking up about 2% of arable land today, we will see this grow, if predictions are right, to about 20% of our arable land, the same arable land we're going to use to try to feed people. The equation's a bit skew. The situation might seem hopeless, but I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say there are possible solutions, and tonight's expert panel will look at food security through a variety of lenses and try to identify ways that the world can deal with current and future food insecurity. We're honoured to have on stage with us tonight 4 speakers who have spent most of their careers studying and reporting on issues of food and farming. First of all, I'd like to introduce Malcolm Duthie, sitting on my left, and he's Country Director of the United Nations World Food Programme in Gambia. Malcolm holds degrees in economics and social planning and development from the University of Queensland. He has wide international experience in working with people in many poor countries, including places like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan and Cambodia. David Crombie is President of the National Farmers Federation. He's a director and chairperson of many national organisations. He's the Vice President of the Australian Rugby Union, so he might be able to talk to us later when we're having some refreshments about why we continue to struggle to beat New Zealand in that code. He operates farming businesses throughout Queensland. Jagjit Plahe is joining us from Melbourne. She's a lecturer in international political economy at Monash University. She's worked for the United Nations and has undertaken projects with several international development institutions. Her special area of interest is the World Trade Organisation's intellectual property rights in seeds and food, which hopefully we'll hear a bit about tonight. She holds degrees from the London School of Economics and Monash. Julian Cribb joins us as well at the end of the table. He's one of Australia's best-known communicators on issues of science, agriculture and the environment. Julian's on the board of many advisory panels on Australian agriculture and has written a new book called The Coming Famine, The Global Food Crisis and What We Can Do to Avoid It, which is a fantastic book, and I'd recommend you purchase it and read it. It gives a comprehensive overview of the problems that we're addressing tonight, and it was published this year by the University of California Press.
We stand at the threshold of what is probably the greatest challenge in our history, feeding ourselves through the mid-century peak in human numbers and demand for food. And make no mistake, this will determine our destiny, our success or failure in this mission. We've heard about rising demand. Well, first of all, the world population is not going to stop growing in 2050. It's going to keep on going. As far as we know, and at current rates, it will probably peak in the 2060s or the 2070s. at around about 11 billion people. And demand for food will continue to grow with economic growth. And what that basically means is that world food demand is going to double over the next 50 years. And that is going to require us to produce around about 60 quadrillion calories every single day. Now, many people assume that this is a fairly simple thing. We can throw some technology at it, like we did in the 1970s. It's not going to be easy, ladies and gentlemen, because of the growing scarcities of almost all of the key resources that we need to produce food. You take water, for example. City demand has already overtaken agricultural demand for water. Groundwater levels are falling in every country in the world where they are used to produce food. Lakes are shrinking, rivers are emptying. Urban water use is likely to double to 2,800 cubic kilometres by 2050, which is more than we use in the entire irrigation sector today. That's at the time when farmers are going to be asked to double food production on perhaps half the water. The International Water Management Institute says we will not have enough water to feed ourselves by 2030. So the warning is already there, it's crystal clear. Have a look at what's happening in farmland. The stock of good arable land worldwide is declining. A recent study by FAO says that 24% of the world's land area is degraded, and we have been degrading or losing land at a rate of 1% per annum. Now, if you do the calculation, and we continue to degrade or lose 1% of our farmland every year, how much are we going to have left in 2050 on which to double food production? City areas are already doubling, and because cities are in river valleys and on coastal plains, they take the best farmland. They push agriculture out into marginal country, where drought is more common, where soil erosion is worse. So cities are a major factor in all of this. They are influencing the way agriculture develops. By 2050, the total area of the world's cities will be equal to the land area of China. And the recreational catchment, all those golf courses and horse farms and holiday farms and things like that around them, will equal the land area of the United States. And that is all nearly prime farm land, which will never produce food again, because it will be priced out of agriculture. Next, there is nutrients. We currently lose probably 80 or 90% of the nutrients in our total chain. And this has been a recent development, ladies and gentlemen. For 5,000 years we have fed ourselves sustainably with nutrients. Now we waste everything. We dig it out of the ground or out of the soil, we mine the nutrients, we lose them on the farm, we lose them in the process of transporting to the cities, we lose them when we process food, and we throw them away when we get to the cities, either as food or as sewage. But we are hemorrhaging nutrients. The green thing is the Olympic yachting course, you might remember, at China. That's what nutrient pollution is doing to the seas as we lose all of these nutrients into the oceans. It's making them unfishable, apart from anything else. The world has already passed peak phosphate, according to Canadian Patrick Derry, and other scientists say it's very, very close. That means that the demand for phosphate is going to outrun the discovery of new supplies. The quality of the phosphate reserves is going down, and the amount of fossil fuel we've got to use to exploit them is going up. So fertiliser could become very scarce, and it could become very, very expensive in time to come. So this is a concern. We've heard this one for a long time now. The International Energy Agency says peak oil is going to happen this decade, and peak gas not long after that. What are we going to put in our tractors, in our pumps, and in the trucks that bring the food to those mighty cities? How are we going to feed those cities if the trucks stop coming? Cities of 20, 30 and 40 million people that do not produce a single bit of food for themselves. What is going to happen if those trucks don't arrive? Where is the energy going to come from? If you grew all that energy on farm, and we could do that easily, ladies and gentlemen, but if the farmers supplied their own energy, it would reduce the world food production by 10% at a time we need to double it. If they provided the fuel to go in the trucks, it would reduce world food production by 30%. So growing it on food-producing land and with food-producing resources is not an option. This is an example of where we really have taken our eye off the ball. The world's farmers are driving into a huge technology pothole because governments around the world have disinvested in agricultural science and technology. The technology that produced the Green Revolution, and indeed the current population boom, has been neglected. The Western world in 2000 invested 1.8 cents of every science dollar in agriculture and food production. So unimportant has this area become to them. So really there is and the results we're now seeing, the rate of yield increases and productivity gains worldwide is dropping away. It's quite clear. 29% of the world's fisheries have collapsed. FAO, very conservative organisation, really believes we're not going to get another 100 million tonnes of fish out of the sea. Right? We're not going to be able to double the fish catch. We might be able to hang on to some of these fisheries if we manage them well. But that means there's 100 million tonnes of protein we're going to have to produce from the land. And to produce that amount of protein from the land takes 1 billion tonnes of grain and 1,000 cubic kilometres of water. And if you added that to the natural increase in meat demand that FAO is forecasting, just to put it in perspective for you, we need to discover 3 more North Americas to produce enough grain to feed all those livestock. That gives you an idea of the scale, the magnitude of the challenge. And at the same time this is all happening, the climate around us is changing profoundly from the one in which agriculture first developed. That's the UK Hadley Centre's climate models, what they're predicting. They have the best model in the world at the moment. They ran it backwards and it successfully replicated the climate of the 20th century. They ran it forward and they got 40% of the world in drought. It's only a climate model, but we ought to be concerned about it. If 40% of the world, especially the mid-latitudes where the grain is grown, is heading into regular drought by the end of this century, we ought to be very concerned. Without adaptation, this means that food production could go down by between 15 and 50% in Asia and Africa. Now, those are estimates from the International Food Policy Research Institute, the World Bank. They're respectable institutes. They don't blow the whistle on things that are trivial. Even here in Australia, CSIRO is saying if we don't adapt, we will be importing grain by 2050. So this is a considerable issue. So just putting all this together, the challenge facing the world's farmers and food producers is to double output using less land, far less water, less energy, different energy, fewer nutrients, and with the prospect of less technology to do so in the teeth of changing climates. Now, why this is urgent, ladies and gentlemen, is if you read the literature that the world's leading defence think tanks are putting out, they identify food, land and water as a primary source of conflict in the human race over the coming 50 years. Darfur, Rwanda, Eritrea, the Balkans, if you dissect those conflicts at root, you will find there was an argument between different groups and people over food, land and water. Who controls the river valley? Who controls the well? Who has the grazing rights? These are fundamental to the survival of ordinary human beings and their children, and they're prepared to fight and even commit genocide to protect them. So this is an area of conflict that we, the human race, do not need to have, and which we can prevent. If you look at it in terms of the resources that we're taking today, it is probable, on the basis of what I've shown you, that the human diet and the modern agricultural systems are not sustainable at the levels of demand that we're expecting. So our challenge is to reinvent them. We have to reinvent both, not just the farming systems, but also what we put in our mouths. The situation is challenging, but it's far from hopeless. It contains major opportunities for agriculturally efficient and flexible producers like Australia who have a strong knowledge base and especially experience in handling drought and highly variable climates, and a clear sense of what is required to sustain food production in difficult conditions. Now, I'm going to go straight to the solutions rather than discuss this, because I think that's the most important thing. In the coming famine, I explore a range of possible solutions, but these are mine. We need to reinvent farming systems. We really do. We need to bring the organic agriculture and the modern intensive agriculture together and get the best ideas from both of them, subject to science. We need massive reinvestment in agricultural science and technology to make up for the lag that's gone on the last 30 years. Those farming systems are going to have to produce twice the food, but with far fewer, far lower inputs. This is a great intellectual challenge, but it's one that we can solve, I believe. We need to develop sustainable energy sources for agriculture, and there are many opportunities, but there's not much focus going on at the moment on energy sources that don't compete with food and things like that. I think we need to design the world diet, redesign the world diet, especially that in the Western world. One that is much less energy intensive, one that treads less heavily on the planet, and particularly one that doesn't kill half its consumers, like the current Australian diet. The increase in global investment in agricultural science and technology, that's my estimate of what we need. That is not only research, it is also delivering the knowledge and sharing the knowledge with 1.8 billion farmers worldwide. So there's a big communications task involved in this. It's not just doing stuff in the laboratory. Where are we going to get the money? Well, we're currently spending $1.5 trillion a year on weapons to kill one another. So if you levy the weapons budget 10% to sustain agriculture, you will A, have a sustainable diet, and B, you'll have a more peaceful world. Agriculture is defence spending. That's what these defence think tanks are pointing out to us. We want peace, we need full plates. Ladies and gentlemen, in the Western world we throw away half the food that we actually produce. We trash half our farmers' efforts. It's a disgrace. Our grandparents would say it was completely stupid, and they would be right. You know, it's going out of the restaurants, out the back of the restaurants. We're throwing the pizza away before we've eaten even half of it. It's in the homes. There is a tradition of junking food now in our society, which every other generation of humans would be appalled by. Those nutrients are going to landfill. They are not even going back into agriculture, although there are nascent attempts to put them there. So we need, ladies and gentlemen, a world war on waste. A world war on the post-harvest losses in the developing world, and a world war on the trashing of food in the developed world. We need to turn our cities into huge mines of water and nutrients, which go back into agriculture, back into food production, instead of sending it to the bottom of the deep oceans, which is a silly thing to do. To do this, we are going to need to have the cooperation of every consumer on the planet, all 10 billion of them. And to do that, I'm calling for a food year in every junior school on Earth. This is a year when, whatever you study, mathematics, social studies, sport, arts, whatever, there is a food theme to it. You understand a little bit more about where your food comes from, how much it costs to get to you, who produces it, its real value to our civilization. We need to teach urban humans especially a new respect for this precious thing that keeps us alive. And finally, we need to give farmers a pay rise. I mean, farmers are being seriously dudded by the globalisation of food now. There's been, in the last 10 years, massive concentration in buying power among a very, very small number of supermarkets and food processing companies. And there has been equally massive concentration, as you've just heard, in the agricultural input end of things. Both of those people can dictate the price the farmer pays or receives. And the farmer is being squeezed in the middle, and this is destroying agricultural industries and communities all around the world. If we want to reinvigorate our agriculture worldwide, we have to change the economic signal. It is no good sending farmers a negative economic signal that tells them not to farm, not to adopt new technology, not to take the risks. We have to give them the incentive. That applies in every sector of the economy that has prospered. We need to make this investment now and stop running down our agricultural resources. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a very brief summary of global food threats, opportunities and solutions. Thank you very much.
So today I'm going to look at intellectual property rules and implications for traditional knowledge of communities, particularly in the developing world, and for food security. The outline of my presentation is as follows. I'm going to start by giving you the agri-food chain, the agri-business value chain, and I'm going to, within that chain, tell you the section where I'm going to concentrate. I'm then going to turn to the World Trade Organization rules on intellectual property, and I'm going to talk about how these rules have been globalized through the World Trade Organization and through what we call free trade agreements. And I'm going to talk about the implications of these rules for food security, for traditional knowledge, for biodiversity, and if I have time, I'll talk about nutrition and health, because you just can't talk about food security when you just focusing on grains, for instance. When we think about food security, we're thinking about grains, and in India, for the first time, we're seeing diabetes amongst the poorest of the poor because they're eating white rice, and white rice has no nutrition. So there might be food security in the sense there's rice that's coming in, but without vegetables and lentils and other nutritious food, there is no nutrition in that. All right, so that's the chain. I am going to focus on the second column. Within the chain, you have all sorts of industries in the agri-food chain. You have the genes, seeds, and chemical inputs industry. You have the food and fiber trading and raw processing industry. You have further processing and manufacturing industry, and then you have the retailers, supermarkets, and we're all very familiar with them, the two that we have in this country, in the name of competition. I want to focus on that second column because these companies that control genes, seeds, and chemical inputs are shrinking in number. We are all familiar with the names Monsanto, DuPont, Syngenta, Bayer. They, as I said, their core activity is seed and agrochemical production. So Monsanto produces a herbicide called Roundup that all of us know, I'm very familiar with, but then has also produced a seed that is resistant to that herbicide, and so you get Roundup Ready seed. So when you spray the herbicide on the actual plant, the plant will not die, but the weeds around it will die. So we've got this herbicide-resistant plant, and this is how they've made money, and Monsanto controls 90% of the GM market. Major issues, there are the first issue is, of course, there are several issues. The first is control over intellectual property. So Monsanto creates this, but is able to monopolize this knowledge through the control of patent rights and what we know as plant breeders' rights, the two forms of intellectual property that I'm going to focus on today. There are other concerns around the fact that these technologies are not appropriate for the poor. I'm not going to go there. I think it requires more time. Also, people are concerned that the GM technology is eliminating sustainable agriculture alternatives. This is a widely held view, and we also know that there have been these GM wars between the United States and the European Union, the transatlantic divide on this issue because of safety. People are concerned about this. And then towards the end of my presentation, I'll talk about the key impacts for farmers and for communities. Turning to the WTO system, this is the World Trade Organization. It has 153 members. And many of them are least developed countries and economically poor developing countries. In fact, most of the members of the WTO are developing countries. It has three major agreements. The first one deals with trade in goods, the second one, which is known as GATS, the General Agreement on Trade in Services, and the third one is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. The reason it's called trade-related aspects is many people don't understand what an intellectual property rights agreement, which creates artificial monopolies, is doing in a free trade structure. It's quite an interesting agreement. It was negotiated in the Uruguay round, and I'll come to that in a moment about how that went through. And then, of course, this is all underpinned by the dispute settlement system, arguably the world's most powerful court, all right, because the decisions of the dispute settlement body of the WTO can be enforced. And as a last resort, sanctions can be taken against countries under the WTO's dispute settlement system. You also have preferential trading arrangements. They're also known as free trade agreements. Australia has a free trade agreement with the United States. Australia has a free trade agreement with New Zealand. And Australia and New Zealand are negotiating a free trade agreement with some of the poorest countries in the region, the Pacific Island nations. And it is through these kind of agreements that we actually bring in intellectual property rights rules, in the name of development, I must add. Now, when the TRIPS was being negotiated in the 80s, most developed countries at that time deemed microorganisms and transgenic plants and animals to be patentable. Okay, they could be protected by private property rights. So when you think about property rights, you think about Michael Jackson, you think about authors, Arundhati Roy. You don't really think about plants. And if you go to Thailand and say that jasmine plant or that basmati plant now belongs to a company, it is actually quite alien to certain cultures to own life. Now, it may not be here, but for a very long time, patentability of life forms was not allowed under law. Now, this was not the case in developing countries. India, for example, when India became independent, it took from 1947 to 1970 for them to put into place an intellectual property rights regime, and they decided then that they would not include agriculture and food within IP. That means private property rights could not cover agriculture and food in the name of food security and protecting this sector. Okay? It took a long time to establish those rules. Of course, under the WTO, those rules were overturned completely. Now, what has the TRIPS agreement of the WTO done? It has globalized the regulation of intellectual property. Okay? It has globalized the extension of private property rights to plants and to plant genetic resources. Now, under there's an article in TRIPS known as 27.3b. Plants and animals cannot be patented, all right? But plants and animals cannot be patented, but microorganisms can, all right? Essentially, biological processes of producing plants and animals cannot be patented, but non-biological processes can be. Now, what does non-biological mean? If we have scientists here, I mean, honestly, if you're doing something in a laboratory, does that make it non-biological? These words were not defined, but basically what it meant was that a microorganism eventually grows into a plant, and that plant can be protected through private property rights, unless you put it in your law and you say it's not allowed. Okay? Then there's the other thing there, which is plants and animals were excluded, microorganisms had to go in, but plant varieties had to be protected. So we don't have one variety of rice, we have thousands. So plant varieties had to be protected either through patents or through a unique system. And that unique system is called sui generis. They're just hard words, but what it means is extension of private property rights to plants, to life, actually. Sorry, the patent owner under TRIPS has the exclusive right to prevent anybody from making, using, selling, offering for sale, or importing the product without the consent of the owner for 20 years. So the example I give you here is the of basmati rice. As you know, basmati, we all know about basmati, it's very good. If you have hypoglycemia, it doesn't give you those spikes in sugar, and you're often told that, have brown basmati, it's aromatic. There was a company United States called Rice Tech that decided to cross basmati with an American variety, a semi-dwarf variety, and they produced what they call a new variety, because to patent a variety, it has to be new. And they had the exclusive right to call that rice basmati. That means nobody else could sell rice in the United States under the name of basmati. Okay, so you can imagine what this did to the exporters in India. Forget about the farmers. The exporters make quite a lot of money. And they, with the help of their government, over many, many years, fought a battle in the United States and said that patent needs to be overturned because there's nothing new about what you have produced. This knowledge has been there in India for a very long time. Same for the neem. The neem patent was revoked by the European Patent Office. And the turmeric patent. If you know turmeric, it's got many antibiotic and antibacterial properties. It's got nutritional value. And the patent had to be then revoked. But developing countries have to be on their toes and fight these really expensive legal battles and say, this belongs to us, I'm sorry. Now, the major problem with this is the concentration in the gene, seed, and chemical industry. I'll give you some examples. 6 transnational corporations, including Bayer, Dow, DuPont, Monsanto, and Syngenta, control close to 80% of the global pesticides market. This is really, really important for us to think about carefully when we think about food security, because the kind of agricultural system we have, it is dependent on hybrid and high-yielding varieties and on chemical fertilizers and on pesticides. And these pesticides are in the control of a very small number of companies. And that is a problem because they get expensive. When Monsanto controls 90% of the GM market for canola and soy, etc., Monsanto controls the price as well. And the figures are out in the United States. Seeds, Monsanto GM seeds, are 6 times more expensive than conventional seeds. Do they get 6 times more output? Some farmers are saying no, they don't get 6 times more output. Concentration of patent control. So these companies, not only do they have a large share of the market, they also control the patents. 20 years, that's the minimum under TRIPS. In other countries, this could be 25 years, it could be 30 years. TRIPS has just said 20 years for every country, including the poorest countries in the world, such as Tonga, Uganda. All right, I have a minute. So this is, I'm sorry it's not very clear, this is how Monsanto gains control, mergers and acquisitions. Recently took over a company that controls vegetables, so Monsanto is now into vegetables. Of course, these are not GM, they're not all GM, because it doesn't have to be GM to be protected by intellectual property. You can just make some change to it, or if a particular variety has never been offered in the market before, interestingly enough, the definition that when you first bring it to the market, it becomes novel. That is the definition for, that is the criteria you have to meet for a plant breeder's right. And so what Monsanto is doing very busily is going and introducing new varieties in many, many different countries and is controlling them. I'm just about to end. My argument is that this kind of control does have implications for food security. It has implications for traditional knowledge. It also has implications for nutrition, because when we introduce one kind of seed, and we're losing biodiversity, and we don't really know, as I gave you the example of white rice, we don't just need white rice, we need many other things to get nutrition. So we need a varied diet. Okay, I just want to finish by two tables. This is research that I've done in India. This is from 2007 to 2009. These are applications for plant breeders' rights. India's law came into effect very recently under TRIPS. Look at the first column. These are food security crops: rice, wheat, millet. Very, very nutritious. Millet is very nutritious. Pigeon pea, garden pea, chickpea, lentils. This is where they get their protein from. These have been monopolized under this first column, extant varieties. What are extant varieties? Varieties already in the public domain. Already in the public domain, they're now being monopolized. And this is the same story for patents in the agrochemical, food and biotechnology sectors. Again, you see in a very short period of time, 2.5 years, 710 patents. This is over biotechnology. So this kind of trend, I argue, is extremely worrying from a food security perspective. Thank you.